Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. I am a massive fan of what Jim Nagy and the Oklahoma Sooners have done in the spring transfer portal window. Now, the marquee name that Oklahoma has brought in, Jaden Ott, difference maker. One of the better running backs that you see in the entire country going into 2025. I think Oklahoma had the question of, hey, who's our running back one? That guy that we can give 20 plus touches to a game and legitimately make a difference for us in the SEC. You answer that question with Jaden Ott. You look at the commitment of Ricky Lolohea coming late Tuesday night. This makes so much sense. And I was kind of thinking about it when it came upon my timeline last night. More teams need to do this kind of thing. And I think this is the impact of Jim Nagy coming into this program, where you look at the commitment of Ricky Lolohea. He's not going to be in the two deep for Oklahoma in the 2025 year. He's going to be that rotational piece that plays maybe 10 snaps a game for Oklahoma. One, that type of body matters. When you're not playing your guys in the two deep and you're trying to rotate some fresher bodies in, how big's the drop off, especially in the SEC? I think Ricky Lolohea can come in and give Oklahoma what they're looking for from a rotational piece in the middle of that defensive line. But what fires me up the most, what makes me so excited about this kind of roster move is, what about the future? This guy's got 3 years of eligibility remaining. You're seeing so many programs have to go into the spring transfer portal window and pay upwards of $1 million for a solid piece in the middle of the defensive line, like we saw Texas do yesterday. You go grab Ricky Lolohea. He's going to be a guy that doesn't immediately provide you 2D player. 2026 or 2027. Like, this guy's got 3 years of eligibility remaining. You're getting a guy that can work his way into the two deep with very little resources getting invested into this kid. It puts you in a better spot over the next couple of years, especially on the defensive line, which is by far the hardest position to address in the transfer portal. I like this for a lot of different reasons. Another thing I like is that Nate Drilling, he knows him. He saw him all year last year, not only in the games, but in practice. So you kind of know not only what kind of player you're getting, but what kind of person you're getting, which is another thing we always talk about in the transfer portal. When you're recruiting these kids out of high school, you get them on campus a bunch of times. You really get to understand not only the player, but who the person is. And hey, are they a good fit for what we're trying to do from a culture standpoint? You don't really get that luxury in the transfer portal. You're kind of blind dating a little bit. We know the player because we can go look at the film, but we don't really know the person. When you have the ability to have a coach on staff that knows the person and feels confident that you're bringing in a good teammate that's going to get better as a football player, that's another plus. You look at this commitment and say it immediately answers your question in 2025 in terms of a rotational depth piece that you can play 10 to 15 snaps a game. That's a true nose that gives you the true nose size, which again, these kind of body types are hard to come by. And a guy that could blossom into, I don't know if he'll ever be a starter at Oklahoma, but he's probably going to be a solid rotational piece for the next couple of years. And I'll tell you this, teams are paying an arm and a leg for these kind of guys in the transfer portal. Oklahoma gets him early, has 3 years of eligibility to develop them. Makes a lot of sense for a lot of different reasons. Now, we're going to get into a little bit of Ricky Lolohea does. Not a ton of film to go off of, but we can talk about the body and what he's going to do. Want to talk about where else Oklahoma is going. Before we get into it, as always, to the Oklahoma fans, appreciate you guys. Y'all know that when Jim Nagy took this job in Norman, I was really fired up to see what's the roster management look like for Oklahoma. On the surface, I think Jim Nagy's done an excellent job, and it's been a blast talking about it. Cannot thank you guys enough for rocking with it. If you all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Many of you all know this is my jam. Like, this is the type of stuff in the off season that I really do like to talk about, especially in this modern era of college football where there's so many different ways to go about building a roster and managing a roster. Really excited to see how Jim Nagy decides to do it. And we're kind of getting a feel. You can use the transfer portal to immediately address a concern, which I think Oklahoma is doing in this case too, like a rotational piece that's going to play, 10, 15 solid snaps a game. But you can also use the transfer portal to set yourself up for the future. And I think that the most intriguing part about Ricky is he does have 3 years of eligibility with a frame and body type that you really like. Now, getting into the body of Ricky Lolohea, true knows, man. Yeah, he's going to line up head up on the center, maybe shade, a guy that not going to light it up in the box score, but a guy that when you look at other elite defenses across the country, every team has a kind of guy like this where they're not necessarily lighting up the stat sheet, but they're helping everybody around them. You talk about next year in 2027, you talk about a guy like David Stone, who you want to play more in space, a little bit more at the 3-tech. Ricky Lolohea gives you that nose body to allow you to be creative with a guy like David Stone or a guy like Jaden Jackson. Secondly, fast athletic linebackers that want to play in space. You want to get the best out of your linebacker position. You damn well better be putting bodies like this in front of these linebackers, keeping them clean. Not a guy that's going to be a first-team All-SEC guy. Not a guy that's going to go for 10-plus sacks, but a body type that's important and a guy that you have 3 years of eligibility. So 12 months from now, when we're going into next year's winter or spring transfer portal window, Oklahoma doesn't have to be in a spot where we are desperate to go pay upwards of $1 million for a rotational body on the defensive line. Want to talk about where Oklahoma's kind of going, and you look at the depth chart here again. What stands out to me is Oklahoma from a depth standpoint in the middle of that defensive line, the two deep. Name me a better two deep in the country, and I'm a Michigan fan. I think our two deep's pretty damn good in the middle of that defensive line. Name me a two deep in the defensive line, or name me a two deep in the country that has that's better than Oklahoma up front. Dominic Williams, Jaden Jackson, Grayson Halton. Y'all know he's my guy. David Stone. It doesn't get much better than that. We were wondering, all right, who's defensive tackle 5'6"? Like, who are the guys that we can count on to play 10 to 15 quality snaps? Ricky Lolohea, kind of fills that void. And as Dominic Williams moves on to the NFL, as Grayson Halton moves on to the NFL, Ricky probably can slide into your two deep next year. In Oklahoma going into the 2026 season is going to be sitting in a good spot and doesn't have to get super desperate for a ton of bodies in the middle of that defensive line. Where else might they go? I mean, I want to talk really quick about the wide receiver position. You've seen some buzz around Keelan Marion. I'll say this. I'm kind of happy that Oklahoma is not, or at least seemingly not, turning it up all the way on this kid. And look, I might just be wrong in my evaluation. I think and it's not me getting up here and saying he's a bad wide receiver. Certainly not. He's a veteran wide receiver that's been productive in the slot, been productive out wide, can do a lot of different things. I just don't see him as the 18th best wide receiver that's in the portal. And I look at the market that's developing for Keelan Marion and say, it seems a little high. And we know Jim Nagy is going to be very diligent about not overpaying players. You saw that with David Stone. Like, hey, we love David Stone. We want him to be on our roster in 2025, but we can't overpay what your value is. I look at Keelan Marion. I'm not surprised that Oklahoma is not necessarily going after him because the market for this kid just seems, and I think it has a lot to do with, there's a lot of teams that want to address the wide receiver position and are willing to pay a little bit over value. And Jim Nagy has a process. I don't think Jim Nagy wants to disrupt that process. And I think that's why you're seeing Oklahoma probably cool on a guy like Keelan Marion. We'll see. Maybe they decide to turn it up. The wide receiver position is one of the last, and one of the things that, sorry, I'm kind of going all over the place here. One of the things that really stands out to me about what Oklahoma has done is, number one, they've retained their talent really well. Most notably a guy like David Stone, but you go back to this depth chart, like, there are a lot of really good players that would probably play on a lot of other teams, especially at that linebacker room. Kobe McKenzie and Kip Lewis, Samuel, Kendall Daniels, so it's a lot of talent in that linebacker room that they've been able to retain and keep on the roster. So I think player retention has been really good. And then the other storyline is, look, Oklahoma has not gone after a single offensive lineman since adding a guy like Jake Maikula. That tells me maybe Oklahoma's a little bit more comfortable with the bodies that they have on the offensive line coming out of spring practice than maybe we thought they were going to be. You can go back to last year. Like, it was very clear as day that Oklahoma wasn't very comfortable with that offensive line. They were doing their due diligence on about every offensive lineman that was in the portal. this year, especially in the spring coming out of spring practice, I think Oklahoma's pretty happy there. And that's a big storyline because that's the hinge point for this Oklahoma team. You have a quality offensive line that allows you to run the football and keep John Mateer clean. This offense should be pretty dang good because I know John Mateer is a good quarterback and I know Ben Arbuckle is a great offense coordinator. That stands out to me as well. So player retention, not really looking too hard on the offensive line. I think that stands out to me about Oklahoma. To me, they're one of the bigger winners that we've seen in the spring portal the spring portal window, I should say. We'll close it out there. Appreciate it. Well, I guess one more. Oklahoma sniffing around some tight ends. Again, that's a position I don't think you need to overpay for. And it's not because I'm super confident in the tight end room, because I don't think many Oklahoma fans probably are. It's more just like positional value. For a team like Michigan, I'm a Michigan fan. Tight ends are massive in our offense. We should, if we don't have good tight ends, we'll overpay. For Oklahoma, I look at the Ben Arbuckle offense. Look, the tight end position's not crucial to the success of this Oklahoma team. And so I look at it and say, even if you maybe have question marks about the personnel, I don't know how much it's going to impact your team in the 2025 year. We'll close it out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. Going to be really fun to see the kind of remaining moves that Oklahoma decides to make. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.